Our speaker tonight, Patrick Comins, is the Executive Director of the Connecticut Audubon Society and long has been active in Connecticut birding and conservation. He has led birding trips virtually everywhere in Connecticut and conducted workshops for COA for many years. He is also a former COA president and was the recipient of the Mabel Osgood Wright Award in 2007. He is a leading authority on conservation of Connecticut birds and the habitats that support them, and we are delighted to have him here tonight. And with that, I will turn it over to you, Patrick.
Great. Thank you so much, Allison. So, welcome, everybody, and thank you for joining us. And we're going to be talking about shorebirds tonight. Part of this was funded by the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation, so I just wanted to let everybody know that the views and conclusions contained in this document are those of the authors and should not be interpreted as representing the opinions or policies of the U.S. government or the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation or its funding sources. Mention of trade names or commercial products does not constitute their endorsement by the U.S. government, National Fish and Wildlife Foundation, or its funding sources. They have their own ways of identifying birds, I guess. There's two ways to think of shorebirds. One way we can think of it is birds that we see at the shore, like the egrets and herons, or waterfowl, such as red-breasted merganser. Gulls, we could do a whole presentation on gulls, I assure you. Or a very favorite, snowy owls, which are much more common at the coast. Or terns, and in the case of our field section, we do tend to do both terns and shorebirds. But the focus of today's presentation is on the true shorebirds, or as the British would call them, the waders. As the plovers, the oyster catchers, the stilts and avocets, and the sandpipers and phalaropes. 46 species have been recorded in Connecticut, and I think I cover all of them in this presentation. First of all, there are the plovers, which are generally identified by their short bill and relatively large eyes. They tend to be visual hunters, so their eyes are much larger in proportion to their head than most shorebirds. Plus, they also tend to be active crepuscularly and at night. This happens to be a piping plover. The oyster catchers, really no introduction necessary. They're pretty obvious looking with their fighting. They're fighting chicken legs. Their bright red bills, long red bills, and striking brown and black colors. The stilts and avocets, of which we have two species that have been found here in Connecticut, the black-necked stilt and the American avocet, general shorebirds. The calidrids, the tringas, the calidrids are what are known as the peeps, things like the least sandpiper. This happens to be a least sandpiper here. The Semipermanent Sandpiper, the western, etc. And the tattlers, the tringa sandpipers. This happens to be a solitary sandpiper, but things like the the spotted sandpiper and the Yellowlegs fit into this category as well. The Godwits, the curlews, the dowagers, the woodcocks, snipe, the turnstones, and the phalaropes. See, I told you it's a really big family. To start out here, we're going to talk a little bit by shorebirds by the season and talk about a year in the life of Connecticut shorebirds, or shorebirding in Connecticut. And there are shorebirds here in the wintertime. It's only a handful of species. It makes it easy to know what you might have on your hands. The most common is probably the sanderling, which tends to be very pale looking in the wintertime, very pale gray, almost whitish. The white belly with not much darker, very much contrast in the wintertime. Second most common is the dunlin, which is also tends to be very pale gray, but you can see there's a bit more contrast between the upper and the lower parts. The bill tends to be longer and decurved like a curlew, whereas it's relatively straight, just a little bit of decurvature in a sanderling. We also get a few at the coast. We get a few wintering over black-bellied plovers. Note how big this bill is. That's one thing later on in this when we get into the golden plovers. That's a big difference between the two of these. And plus, you'll never find a golden plover here in the wintertime. Knock on wood. And if you do, it's not an American golden plover. The purple sandpiper tends to be found around rocky coastlines. This is a photo of a purple sandpiper by A.J. Hand, and a purple sandpiper photo by me that I got out at Beavertail in Rhode Island. We get a few ruddy turnstones in the wintertime. Pretty obvious. They're the only ones with any sort of bright colors, bright contrasting colors on them in the wintertime. We do get a few Wilson snipe in mild winters. And this can be inland as well. And surprisingly, you know, they can get into very small patches of open mud when it's otherwise snow on the ground. And they also tend to be a very early migrant. But you can see we're just at the northern tip of their wintering range. Killdeer, likewise, a few spend the winter along the coast, but also they tend to be a harbinger of spring. On a late winter evening, and hearing the killdeer flying around tends to be, to me, a sign that spring has really arrived. So they say they're one of the names there is killdeer, 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 killdeer. American woodcock is another one that can be seen here in the wintertime, or technically in the wintertime. They tend to be a very early migrant, and what they do is they press their limits. They push their luck, trying to get as far north as they can in springtime, so that they can find their way to the best territory. And sometimes it pays off for them and they get to the best territory. Sometimes it doesn't pay off and a snowstorm hits and they don't make it. But to them, with their biology, it's far more important for them to reproduce than it is to survive, because the way their species works is through a high reproduction rate rather than long survival. On the other hand, oyster catchers are the opposite of that biological scheme. They survive as a species by being very long-lived and tend to have very low productivity rates. But oyster catchers now are beginning to winter over in Connecticut. And usually one or two or three, you know, handful that winter over. But they can be seen up to Christmas bird count very easily, and also tend to be very early migrants and will arrive while it's technically still winter. Spotted redshank, not exactly a regular wintering species here in Connecticut, but the one spotted redshank that had been recorded in Connecticut was recorded in the wintertime in New Haven Harbor. But many of our shorebirds will be found much further south during the wintertime. Red knot, although it's possible to have a red knot here in the wintertime, there is a population that winters just to our south in New Jersey. The bulk of red knots winter either on the Gulf Coast or way down here in southern South America. In fact, the typical red knot of the roofer red knot migrates 20,000 miles a year. They fly in the spring from Brazil directly to Delaware Bay nonstop, which is one reason why horseshoe crab eggs are so important to the biology of red knots. They need something to fatten up after that long nonstop journey. By its 13th birthday, a red knot will have flown a distance to the moon and back. Another one that tends to winter very far to the south is the American golden plover. You can see this, the bill compared to the blackbelly plover I showed you earlier in the wintering bird. Winter down here in the southern cone grasslands of Argentina, Paraguay, Uruguay, southern Brazil. Likewise for the upland sandpiper. You're not going to find an upland sandpiper in the wintertime around here. They're down in South America. Or the Hudsonian godwit. There are even two species that spend their winter on the ocean. The red phalarope nests off of the coast of Africa. I mean, which winters off the coast of Africa and South America. And the red-necked phalarope. But we do get these species occasionally in migration. We don't get red phalarope as often as we get the red-necked phalarope. Unfortunately, the red phalarope tends to, it's also known as the gray phalarope in Europe, tends to have a shorter bill than the red-necked phalarope. Tends to be much plainer gray, whereas the red-necked phalarope, even in the plainest of migration that we see him in these latitudes, has this mix of black and white and gray. Sometimes a striking mix of black and white. This was one that we were lucky enough to see at Hammonasset a few years back. There are 7 species of shorebirds that actually nest here in Connecticut. Some are confined to the shore, like the American oystercatcher. These are oystercatcher eggs. Incredibly well camouflaged, and they do, that's their survival technique, is to have their eggs very camouflaged. And you can be, well, you shouldn't be, but if you're working with them, you could be 10 feet away from them and not see that, you know, and have the eggs in your sight, take your eyes off of them and not be able to find the eggs again. They're so well camouflaged. After about 4 weeks, the eggs hatch. And for about 4 weeks, the chicks are running around on these fairly muscular legs they have. The piping plover, another species that nests only on the coast. Again, with its precocial chicks that for about 4 weeks are running around before they can fly. Another species that relies on camouflage for its eggs. We give it a little bit of extra help by putting up what are known as exclosures around the eggs, because the plovers are at a certain size where they can go in and out of these exclosures, whereas the predators cannot. You can see this is one of the chicks. It's actually the first day the chick was born. Chick had hatched. It's underneath the mama plover here, and this is one of 2 chicks from that nest, and this was the day it fledged. It was so almost 4 weeks to the day. Went from this to this, and this is presumably the mother as well. Willets also nest along the coast. They nest in tidal marshes and along islands and beaches. In fall migration, we get a visitor from the west, known as the western willet. Still at this point, the same species of willet, but our willets tend to be much darker and heavily marked. You can see this is an eastern willet here. This is a western willet, which tend to be larger. They have a more bicolored bill, which is longer. They tend to be much paler. Here's a close-up of a western willet. A little bit earlier in the season, so a little better marked, but you can still see that distinctly bicolored bill, which is quite long. And the overall. Some nest throughout Connecticut, including the spotted sandpiper. This is an adult spotted sandpiper. Breeding plumage. And this is a juvenile spotted sandpiper, no spots. One thing that's fairly common among the juvenile sandpipers is that their feathers tend to be individually fringed because their feathers are all of the same age. So you can often tell each individual feather tract. Killdeer also nest throughout the state. Sometimes we get calls saying, oh, there's a piping plover nesting in the parking lot. Almost invariably, well, pretty much invariably, it's a killdeer. Piping plovers have a single neck band. The killdeer are much larger, have two bands, and tend to be a lot darker in color, sort of this ruddy brick red, as opposed to the color of dry sand, which is what piping plovers are. Others nest exclusively in grasslands. This is the Upland Sandpiper, which is sort of an exception. I talked about how plovers have a very short bill and very large eyes. Well, Upland Sandpipers also tend to be nocturnal hunters as well, and very visual hunters, and have this very short bill and large eyes, although it is a thinner and finer bill than typical plover. In fact, they used to be called upland plover. Here's a sandpiper flying around at the breeding grounds. They make an interesting sound you don't hear very often in Connecticut anymore, because they are one of our most endangered nesting species in the state. Some of our shorebirds even nest in our shrublands and forests, meaning the American woodcock. Figured I had to slip in a picture of a woodcock that I took. It's either a woodcock or a flying elephant, but I'm pretty sure it's a woodcock. Spring brings a great variety of shorebirds to Connecticut, and is a great time to go out and see them, because they're in their breeding plumage. Using Connecticut, it's an important pit stop for them on the way to their breeding grounds further to the north. Some of our plain wintering birds, like this, like the dunlin, look like completely different species in the springtime. In fact, the dunlin used to be called the redback sandpiper. And if you saw them in the wintertime, you'd wonder, why the heck is this bird called a redback sandpiper? This was actually a leucistic dunlin that was at Milford Point 2 years ago. Didn't stay around to make the conversion into breeding plumage, but at least I got a shot of it in the spring, late winter, early spring. Our sanderlings, which were so white in the wintertime, have become speckled brick red and black. Beautiful birds, actually one of my favorite birds. I like to call them the fingerprint bird, because in the springtime, nearly every single one of them looks completely different. The purple sandpipers, they do stick around longer in the spring than we think. They are readily available at a few distinct locations well into May, and they look fairly similar to what they look like in the wintertime, just a little bit darker overall, with brighter legs and brighter orange bill. The Blackbelly Plover, again, note that really large, thick bill in comparison to the American golden plover. In England, they're called, in the UK, they're called the gray plover, because that's typically how they see them. But in the springtime, they can be particularly spectacular with this contrasting white and black with gray upper parts. A few other things for later on, when and I don't have any open wing shots of golden plovers, but a few tips to eliminate golden plover. In addition to that larger bill, the bill size is variable, but on average is much smaller in an American golden plover than it is in a black-bellied plover. But there's a lot more white in the wings of a black-bellied plover. The rump is white, and underneath the wings, there's always this black spot here in the axillaries, black armpits, if you will. So when you see a golden plover in a flock of flying black-bellied plovers, it's usually pretty easy to tell it, because it doesn't have the white rump, it doesn't have the white in the wings, and lacks this black armpits. Semi-palmated plovers, they're somewhat similar to our nesting piping plovers, but they're more the color of wet sand as opposed to dry sand, and or the rocks, if you will. If you see a flock of more than 4 or 5 small plovers, it's almost invariably going to be semi-palmated plovers, because piping plovers tend to not flock up. Semi-palmated sandpiper, and this is about as bright as they get. Well, they get a little bit brighter, but this is a spring semi-palmated sandpiper, not exactly a ostentatious beauty show winner, but still one of my favorite birds. This is one that's you know, really bright by semi-palmated sandpipers. Even has a little bit of rufous edging around the feathers here, a little bit of rufous on the ears, their auriculars, if you will, and on the supercilium. This one's practically Western Sandpiper bright, but has a very short bill. You can see its namesake here. You can see the semi-palmations in between the toes. They have partly webbed feet, which can be handy when trying to rule out a stint when you're looking for one in the fall. Semi-palmated sandpipers are extremely long distance migrants. This one was banded down in Suriname and was photographed at Milford Point. And in the springtime, they tend to be nonstop migrants. That is, they fly directly from Suriname to wherever they end up on the coast, be that Milford Point, be that New Jersey, be that Cape Cod or Maine. And then in the fall migration, they also tend to be long one-hop migrants. That is, they fly from Hudson Bay straight to our shores, fatten up a bit, and then fly directly to South America from here. We do get Western sandpipers in the springtime. They're quite they're quite uncommon. This is a fairly short-billed Western sandpiper, but much brighter than even the brightest semi-palmated sandpiper here. Another thing about Western sandpipers is they tend to be very large-headed. They also tend to have streaks that go well below their wings on their flanks, and quite a bit of red edging on the scapulars. This is the one Western sandpiper I've been able to get photos of in the springtime here in Connecticut. This was during the spring of 2020, and this is a fairly long-billed individual, longer build than typical semi-palmated sandpiper. I wouldn't say than the extreme, but it is a fairly long-billed individual. This red on the cheeks, red crown. Again, the streaking that goes below the bill, below the wings. You can see it here. This is all the same bird. Again, that rich edge, rufous edging to the scapulars, the red in the supercilium, very distinct eye ring. I'll show some comparisons. Notice the head is much larger than the semi-palmated sandpiper. This is a semi-palmated, this is a Western. I have a few comparison shots in here of this bird. I was lucky this bird stayed for about a week and a half, and I was able to get it out on and see it in various different conditions. But you can see the bill much thinner and longer, fairly droopy billed semi-palmated sandpiper. Here's the Western, another semi-palmated sandpiper here. There were also some white rump sandpipers mixed in, which is another species that you can get in spring migration. One thing about white rump sandpipers is that they tend to have a very high voice. They have a very high-pitched insect-like sound that they do. Another thing about white rump sandpipers, in addition to their white rump, you can see a little bit of the white rump here. They tend to be very finely streaked in their spring plumage, both above and below. And there's a little bit of yellow at the base of the bill here. Here's one in flight. You can see the actual white rump. One that's not quite so brightly marked, but still has that very neatly streaked appearance to it, and this little bit of yellow at the base of the bill, and black legs, which helps rule out a pectoral sandpiper. If you're lucky enough to get phalaropes in spring migration, they tend to be quite spectacular. I've never seen a red phalarope that looks like this. I had to borrow this photo off of the internet, or the redneck phalarope. This is a male redneck phalarope in the spring, and I was actually lucky enough to get a female redneck phalarope up at Portland Meadows a few years back. Longer bill than the red phalarope. The red phalarope's bill is yellow as well. We also get the Wilson's phalarope. This is a male Wilson's phalarope, so it's but even longer build than the redneck phalarope. It can be a difficult identification between the two of them. Although female, like this example, this male redneck phalarope in May was initially identified as a Wilson's phalarope, but then people saw how short the bill was and re-identified it as correctly as a Wilson's phalarope. Unfortunately, I don't have a Wilson's phalarope in breeding plumage. The red knot, if you're lucky enough to see red knots in spring migration, they tend to be spectacular looking birds, and they tend to be a little bit later migrants than some of the other shorebirds, and you can get them well into Memorial Day weekend. Solitary sandpiper is one you don't actually see often at the shore. If you want to pick one up, you often have to find one in like a little mud puddle inland. Stilt sandpipers we do occasionally get in spring migration, although this is a juvenile stilt sandpiper. Now, stilt sandpipers are keeps. They're calidrids like these sandpipers and Semipermanent sandpipers, but they have yellow legs, so that's one way of telling them apart. This rufous cheek patch tends to be there in almost any plumage, and they sort of are like a cross between a tringa and a peep. In some ways looking like a lesser Yellowlegs or a solitary sandpiper, but with these bright yellow legs. Fall migration for shorebirds, spring migration is still going well into mid-June, and fall migration begins late June. Pretty much there's overlap. And if you have a bird in late June, it's hard to know if it's a late spring migrant or an early fall migrant. Fall migration has greater variety in plumages. This is an adult sandpiper. This is a juvenile western sandpiper. It's a leucistic sanderling. So this is breeding plumage sanderling. This is a winter plumage sanderling. And basically in the fall migration, you get everything in between. And there's a certain time period when they come through when they all have red on their necks and they all look like redneck stints. This is a juvenile sanderling. Notice on sanderlings, they have no back toe, which is one easy way to tell them apart from a redneck stint. They also are quite a bit bigger. Sort of be probably a springtime flock, considering the variety of plumages. The red knots in the fall tend to be not red. This is an adult red knot in fall migration, as opposed to what they look like in spring migration. And this is a juvenile red knot. And again, with many of the juvenile shorebirds, they all have feathers all of the same age, so they have this scaly look to them. This is a good time to go over some of the different feather tracks that are important in shorebird identification. We mentioned auriculars. It's not as tricky a word as it seems. Just think of aura having to do with the ears. These are the ear coverts, and they're important for western sandpipers. They're important in stilt sandpipers. The lores are the feathers in front of the eyes. There's lateral crown stripe, the crown. This is the supercilium flanks, and the belly. Back here, the hind neck, the mantle, the V braces, the upper scapulars, the lower scapulars, the tertials, and then the wing coverts, the greater, median, and the lesser coverts. The undertail coverts. The primary projection is how far the wings project beyond the tail. We have a greater variety of species in fall migration as well. For example, we don't get too many or any American golden plovers in spring, but we do look forward to them in fall migration. They don't generally look this good, but this is a fairly decent plumaged for us American golden plover. That was at Hammonasset Beach, at Milford Point, again in 2020. This is a juvenile. As I said, their bills can be quite variable. This one's almost needle-like. Another thing that separates it from a blackbelly plover is this distinctly capped appearance. They have the crown generally stays quite dark no matter what plumage, and then there's this bright supercilium. Again, that capped appearance in the juvenile, the bright supercilium contrasting with that bright cap. This one is very much brighter than normal. In fact, some people still see this and say, is that even an American golden plover? Could that be a European golden? I think the consensus has been that it is just a bright American golden plover. This has a fairly large bill for a golden plover, but still not as big as a black-bellied plover. Here you can see the bills of the black. After looking at a few golden plovers, they tend to look very schnozzy, if you will. One of the most tricky set of shorebirds to identify are the two dowagers, the long-billed dowager and the short-billed dowager. This is a short-billed dowager. This is also a short-billed dowager, but of the Hendersonii race, which is the mid-continental race, which tends to be much more brighter brick red, almost much more long-billed dowager-like. Juveniles are fairly easy to identify. We talked about tertials. In juvenile short-billed dowagers, the tertials are strongly marked, whereas in juvenile long-billed dowager, this is photos taken in Iceland by Johan Ole Hilmarsson in 2011, where long-billed dowager is an exceedingly rare bird. The tertials tend to be very plain, without much internal markings on them. Seeing the two dowagers together, they're not all that hard of an identification problem, because the short-billed dowager is quite a bit smaller than a long-billed dowager, and structurally quite a bit different. And so if you see two together, if you're lucky enough to see two together, a long-billed and a short-billed, it can be pretty easy to tell them apart. Also, as we get later and later into the season, more and more into September and into October, the short-billed dowager becomes less common and the long-billed dowager becomes more common. But this is a short-billed dowager, this is a long-billed dowager, showing you the sheer size difference that can occur between the two species. The bill length isn't always particularly helpful, but comparatively next to one another, just the overall size of the bird and overall size of the bill can be remarkable. Here's another version of a long-billed dowager and a dowager. You can see the head shape is quite a bit different as well. This was an adult long-billed dowager, which is pretty uncommon. This was in July, and you can see it had a very, very long bill, but is showing that there are certain short-billed dowagers that have the brick red wash to them. They tend to be a lot more heavily marked on their breast, though, than the long-billed dowagers. Here's a long-billed dowager and a short-billed dowager together at Hammonasset Beach State Park. You can see the size difference. Overall, long-billed dowager is quite a bit plumper bird. You see these bill sizes are not all that much different, but the head size is quite a bit different. And you can see that there's almost a no-necked appearance in the long-billed dowager. Again, this showing just the sheer size of the heads. And overall, the width of the bird. This being the Longbuild Dowager, this being a Shortbuild Dowager. Again, Shortbuild Dowager, Longbuild Dowager. Again, as we get into later and later into the year, it gets to be more and more the default that Longbuild Dowagers are the bird of choice. One thing about the Dowagers, the Longbuild Dowagers, one confirmatory, I wish I could play the sounds, I wish you could hear the sounds. One confirmatory thing is their sounds, but another thing is the tail pattern. In a Longbuild Dowager, the dark of the tail tends to be wider than the lighter portions of the tail, whereas in the Shortbuild Dowager, see the light tends to be darker than, wider than the darker portions of the tail. Another thing that gives some beginning birders the fits, or even some intermediate birders, are Yellowlegs. And especially when you see one together, one solo that isn't together. When you see them together, they're pretty straightforward. But greater Yellowlegs, lesser Yellowlegs, pretty similar looking birds. One thing about the lesser Yellowlegs, the bill tends to be about as long as the head. So if you were to take the bill and measure it, compare it that way, it's going to be about the same size or smaller. Whereas a greater Yellowlegs, it's going to be quite a bit bigger than the head. Again, together, it's not such a problem. These are a couple of lesser Yellowlegs. Behind them are a couple of greater Yellowlegs. For one thing, you look at the ankles. The greater Yellowlegs tend to have much knobbier ankles, whereas lesser Yellowlegs tend to have very almost straight legs, although this lesser has a little bit of knobbiness to it. The greater Yellowlegs are a lot bigger, and occasionally there's a little bit of an upturn to the bill on a greater Yellowlegs. Greater Yellowlegs tend to more often have a bicolored bill to them, as opposed to lesser Yellowlegs. Again, those knobby knees to really ankles. The bill, which is larger than the head, or about the same size as the head in the case of the lesser Yellowlegs, and just quite a bit bigger bird overall. One bird we don't get in the spring is Hudsonian Godwit. If you're lucky, you can get a Hudsonian Godwit. More often they look like this, though, in migration in Connecticut. Marble Godwits. Occasionally we could get one in the spring, but much more common in the fall. Wimbrels, again, much more common in fall migration. And another one of the more difficult identification scenarios in North America are the semi-palmated versus Western sandpipers. This is a semi-palmated sandpiper, an adult semi-palmated sandpiper. And there'll be time for questions after the presentation. My presentation is going to be somewhere a little over an hour, and then we have time for individual questions and going back over some of the more difficult points. This is an adult semi-palmated sandpiper. Adult sandpipers tend to be a fairly messy mix of feathers in fall, from fresh winter feathers to leftover breeding feathers, whereas the juveniles tend to be, all the feathers are of the same age, so they're neat and scaly looking. Semi-palmated sandpiper is our default peep. It's the most abundant in fall migration, unless you happen to be inland, in which case the least sandpiper is a little bit more common than semi-palmated sandpipers. But they can be quite abundant, flocks of up to 5,000 to 10,000 of them at some of their preferred locations along the coast. Again, showing the difference between an adult and a juvenile. That scaly individual feathers of the juvenile, whereas a mix of worn and fresh feathers in the adult. Again, adult, very messy. Two juveniles, including a very bright juvenile, which at the time I was trying to turn into a juvenile stint of some sort, and then a fairly typical juvenile semi-palmated sandpiper. Note that the legs look kind of greenish on this bird, and that's one thing that some of the really brightly colored juvenile semi-palmated sandpipers can have sort of greenish colored legs, whereas the stints tend to have purely black legs. Here's a plumage that we're not going to see in Connecticut. This is actually taken of a captive bird in at the New England Aquarium in the midwinter, and it's pure winter plumage of an adult Semipermanent Sandpiper. And whether or not, Semipermanent Sandpipers occur at all in North America is sometimes a debate. There are certainly Semipermanent birds that have the appearance of Semipermanent Sandpiper that are sighted and photographed in Florida, but some people contend that they're just very short-billed Western Sandpipers. And Western and Semipermanent Sandpipers in full winter plumage are nearly identical plumage-wise. So I thought I'd include this in there. They're an incredibly plain-looking bird, but they also have very high sight fidelity to Suriname and British Guyana and the North Shore of South America. The Western Sandpiper, as we get into September, becomes increasingly higher percentages of juvenile Western Sandpipers that are found in the flock. And some of them are easy to pull out. Others are not so easy to pull out. This is a fairly average looking Western Sandpiper, and its bill is I'd say to the point of extreme longness and droopiness, where Semipermanent Sandpiper alone is ruled out alone on the bill. But you can see there's a slight hint of reddish in these scapulars that contrast with the lower scapulars. And this is an important point in Western Sandpiper versus Semipermanent Sandpiper, is that the Semipermanent Sandpiper tends to lose its upper scapulars first, and the Western Sandpiper tends to lose its lower scapulars first. So I'll show the example. If all the Western Sandpipers look like this one, they wouldn't be so hard to pull out of the flock. An adult Semipermanent Sandpiper in the background, quite plain Jane or plain James, whereas this juvenile Western Sandpiper has these bright red fringed upper scapulars and a bill that is outside of that of a Semipermanent Sandpiper. It's another fairly obvious Western Sandpiper. You can see it's starting to lose the lower upper scapulars as opposed to the upper scapulars first. So the way it works is that this part of the wing of a Western Sandpiper tends to get pale before the last few feathers are lost are on the top row, which is handy because that's where the reddish fringe tends to occur. Here is a not so obvious Western Sandpiper. The bill is probably long enough to rule out Semipermanent, but again, these sort of all fresh feathers down here in the lower part of the wings and the coverts and the lower scapulars, these anchor marks here in the lower scapulars, whereas the upper scapulars are the ones that are retained and have the dark centers and the brick red fringes. Another Western Sandpiper, not very obvious, but again, it's this contrast between the darkest part of the bird are the upper scapulars, and the lower scapulars and the wing coverts tend to be paler. Again, another not so obvious Western Sandpiper. I think a lot of Western Sandpipers go through unnoticed because of this. A little bit of the rufous feathering up here, but again, these dark centered or dark stripe in the center of the feathers down here in the wing coverts and the lower scapulars. Here's a Western that has lost almost all of its juvenile plumage and is almost in full winter plumage. And you can see that these are the lower scapulars here, and you can see that it's the uppermost scapulars that are retained, and just a little fringe of brick red in here. And I could tell this was a Western as opposed to a semi because of these very pale feathers here, contrasting with the darkest feathers up above, even though the bill was not out. So this is what semis tend to look like as we get into September, the juvenile semis. They tend to retain the lowermost scapulars. So notice in here, these are the palest feathers, whereas, yeah, there's some pale feathers here, but there's a sort of a broad swath of dark centered feathers here. And of course, no fringing of the upper scapulars like that bird. And this is sort of a textbook late season Western sandpiper with very pale coverts, lower scapulars, but with that just a hint of retained upper scapulars here. So it's these two rows of feathers right here that tend to be quite different. Least sandpipers, this is a juvenile least sandpiper. They tend to be darker, smaller, smaller build, and yellower legged than the semi-palmated sandpipers. Plus, they lack the semi-palmations in between the toes. So the toes go right up to the foot here. Much darker looking bird than the semi-palmated sandpiper, especially on the breast, which tends to be very well marked. Again, yellowish legs, short, decurved, small, fine bill. This is an adult least sandpiper here. Still very brown on the chest, very brown in comparison to a semi-palmated sandpiper, and a juvenile least sandpiper, which tends to have these prominent white braces on between the scapulars, which is right here, and the mantle. Pectoral sandpipers, or what I call them, the greater least sandpiper, quite similar to a least sandpiper, but they're quite a bit bigger. They're larger than a semi-palmated sandpiper. They look like they're wearing a bib. Here's a juvenile pectoral sandpiper. I had mentioned in white rump sandpipers that they have a little bit of yellow at the base of the bill. It's the same thing with a pectoral sandpiper, but pectoral sandpipers have yellow legs. They're about the same size. Baird sandpiper, another one of the peeps. They have an unnecessary reputation for being difficult to identify. They're quite a bit larger than semi-palmated sandpipers, so if you see them with a flock, they tend to be quite a bit larger, but look how long their wings are. Semi-palmated sandpiper's wings end at like a least sandpiper. They end right at the tail of the Western sandpiper as well. Semi-palmated sandpiper. Baird sandpiper's wings go way past the tail here. They also have a straight, very jet black bill. They tend to be all juveniles, or I can't think of an adult Baird sandpiper that's been seen in Connecticut. So they have this sort of distinctive pumpkin seed look to their backs. They have very weak supercilium and a very well-defined eye ring. Here again, very long tail. Well beyond very, very long wings, well beyond the tail. The other bird that has long wings that go past the tail is the white rump sandpiper. But the white rump sandpiper, again, has, as opposed to this jet black bill, which is not very droopy, they have a droopy bill that has a yellowish base. See, the wings go well past the tail here. And in fall migration, the white rump sandpipers tend to be very pale looking. They lose that fine streak appearance that they had in spring migration and tend to be an overall very dull gray, at least the adults. Still a little hint of yellow at the base of the mandible here, and a very prominent supercilium, and more prominent than the eye ring. This is showing the size. This is going to be similar. This is a semi-palmated sandpiper, and you can see those greenish legs that I was talking about. It's a juvenile semi-palmated sandpiper, but you can see the white rump sandpiper, in addition to the Baird sandpiper, they're both quite a bit bigger than a semi-palmated sandpiper. They're about the size of a semi-palmated plover. And this is a juvenile white rump sandpiper. And you can tell that by somewhat by default, but it's the only species that has the long wings past the tail, jet black legs, and a little bit of yellow at the base of the bill. Quite a bit decurved bill, strong supercilium, fairly weak eye ring, and much more colorful than any band would be. And Dunlin is one of the last migrants that we get in fall migration. For right around Labor Day weekend is when buff-breasted sandpipers, Bairds as well. This was a rare adult buff-breasted sandpiper. Typically, the buff-breasted sandpipers have that pattern that I was talking about, like a Baird sandpiper. But they tend to be much more upright, very plover-like, almost like an upland sandpiper with their large eyes and fine, small bill, yellowish legs. One of the great things about shorebirds is that they are global travelers and can show up almost anywhere. We get all sorts of surprises, like American avocets. There was one at Milford Point this fall migration, but it was summertime. Black-necked stilts. We've had black-tailed godwit. See its normal range map there. We've had bar-tailed godwit. It flies over 6,000 miles nonstop from Alaska to New Zealand. Easy to see how that could get out of range. Curlew sandpipers, which we had one this year after about 20 years absence in Connecticut, found by Frank Matlick. And we were lucky that this bird hung around for at least a couple of weeks. Redneck stint, very much like a semi-palmated sandpiper. This happens to be one that was at Milford Point a few years ago. Well, more than a few years ago, probably about 15 years ago. Little stint, rough, it's sort of a semi-annual vagrant that shows up here from the old world. Sharp-tailed sandpiper, we've only had a handful of records, less than a handful of records of that. Spotted redshank. Wilson's plover, a vagrant from the south. Snowy plover. We had one at Sandy Point. So northern lapwing, which we had one at Milford Point 2 years ago. Long-billed curlew, that's a bird that we're overdue for here in Connecticut, although they're declining quite a bit. It's been a long time since there's been a long-billed curlew in Connecticut. And this was a Pacific golden plover. And when they do show up, they tend to bring crowds along with them. People even drag their kids along who get incredibly bored looking for this bird that looks just like all the other birds. He's 18 now, by the way. One bird that's unfortunately we're not going to see in Connecticut anymore is the Eskimo curlew. And like many, well, Eskimo curlews are almost certainly extinct, but many of our species of shorebirds are declining at very, very troublesome paces, sometimes 80 to 90% declines over the past 50 years. So wanted to thank Paul Fusco, Mark Santier, and AJ Hand for photo use. Funding for our shorebird work is provided through the Long Island Sound Futures Fund of the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation, the Genium Foundation, the Community Foundation of Eastern Connecticut, and others. I have time for questions.
Thank you so much, Patrick. It's always good to be refreshed on our current and incoming migrant species. And I appreciate the detailedness about particular ID marks for some of those difficult to separate species. I just real quick, while people drop questions here in the chat, could you maybe point out a few locations in Connecticut that generally are good for shorebird spotting?
Sure. Hammonasset is a foul weather friend. I tend to enjoy visiting Hammonasset when it's raining or cloudy, at least, so there's less people there, and particularly when it's raining, when there's some shorebird pools there, that can be good well into October. Milford Point is probably one of the premier shorebird viewing spots in the state. The best time to go is on a falling tide, as the tide is going out. The shorebirds come in and will land at your feet sometimes, right? If you're out by the base of the spit there. Stratford Point is a good place to see roosting shorebirds with a scope at high tide. And then, also I encourage you to check out CT Birds listserv, and also, subscribe to our Rare Bird Alert, to Connecticut Audubon's Rare Bird Alert, which will, and that curlew sandpiper or that broad-billed sandpiper shows up in Connecticut.
Great, thank you. One more question for you. What would you say would be peak shorebird migration here in Connecticut? What time frame?
I'd say from mid-July to early to Labor Day weekend.
Oh boy, that's this coming weekend, isn't it?
Yes.
So hopefully, if you haven't gotten out, folks, now would be a great time to go. Best winter shorebird spots. Is there any change from the list that you gave us there earlier?
Yeah, Long Beach in Stratford is probably the premier spot. Big flocks of Dunlin and Sanderling tend to show up there. Milford Point is still good. Stratford Point can be good as well at high tide. Hammonasset can be decent as well. We can get Sandy Point. Sandy Point is a great shorebird spot pretty much year round. Sandy Point in West Haven.
Awesome. Thank you. Great question. Well, thank you again so much, Patrick, and everyone for attending tonight.